Hello, my name is Mercedes Diez-Prados, and I'm going to talk about persuasion, our module number 9. I'm going to focus on lessons 2 and 3, which are devoted to ethos and pathos and fallacies. Let me recall the 3 appeals that we mentioned in the introduction. We talked about ethos, logos, and pathos. Ethos is an attempt to establish a relationship of trust with the audience and convince them you are someone they should listen to. Logos, in turn, is the use of reasoning to persuade. Logos is addressed particularly to the head, to the brain. As my previous colleagues have mentioned, well, there's the way to use reasoning in order to persuade the audience. The last appeal is called PATHOS, also pronounced pathos, which is an attempt to put the audience in the right frame of mind to accept the speaker's argument. In the same way that logos is addressed to the brain, pathos is addressed to the heart, trying to convince your audience through emotions. We're going to talk about ethos first. We're going to develop this concept, and also we're going to see how we can improve our ethos to persuade our audience. In principle, good people are more believable than bad people. Aristotle, in fact, believed that ethos, or your character, was the most effective means of persuasion. Well, let me ask you a question. Would you trust these politicians equally? On the one hand, we have Martin Luther King Jr., and let me recall his words in one of his most famous speeches, I Have a Dream. He said, I have a dream that my 4 children will one day live in a nation where they will not, the color of their, they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Well, would you trust this politician equally than this one, Adolf Hitler, who's famous for the execution of thousands of Jews in the Second World War? Well, probably your answer is no, right? So ethos, of course, is the character, is the first trait we take into account in order to see who is more persuasive. In turn, right, we have a picture of Mr. King here, and let me ask you the question of who did Mr. King trust, right? If we look on the wall, we can see a picture of Mahatma Gandhi. So, and of course, he was another character that was famous for being a defender of peace. But the thing is, if ethos has to do with our character, how can we improve that, right? That's something, personality is something that is difficult to change. Well, let's see if we can find what experts say on the topic, right? In order to improve your ethos, the first thing you have to do is to show understanding of your subject. That is, have updated information. Also, you should support your claims with trustworthy evidence and logical connection between your ideas, what we call logos. Also, try not to be agitated. Keep your composure right? And also, you need to connect with the audience. We're going to have a look at an example, like Mrs. Bush's address in Wesley's College in 1990. We're going to see how she managed to gain her initial hostile audience. Okay, let's have a look at this example, right? How can we improve our ethos by gaining our audience? Well, in order to answer this question, I'm going to use this example, right? Well, Mrs. Bush was invited to keynote the 1990 graduation ceremony at Wesley College in Massachusetts. This invitation erupted, a controversy erupted regarding this invitation because students thought Mrs. Bush didn't represent the type of career woman the college seeks to educate. Mrs. Bush had dropped out of Smith College after 2 years to marry and had been known as supportive wife and mother in the family of a politician, of course, the president's nation. Wesley students, when they knew Mrs. Bush would be the keynote speaker, organized a protest previous to the ceremony. Well, instead of having Mrs. Bush as a speaker, they actually wanted to have Alice Walker, who was an African-American novelist, and they wanted her to keynote the ceremony instead of Mrs. Bush. And that's why Mrs. Bush encountered a hostile audience, and an audience who didn't trust her ethos when she stood up to start speaking. Okay, in fact, we're going to see that in the end, she managed to gain her audience, and the thing is, how did she do that? I'm going to give you some examples of her parts of her speech to show how she gained her audience. First of all, by acknowledging the students, right? One of her first words were addressed to the students and their surroundings. She said, "I was struck by the natural beauty of your campus and the spirit of this place." Also, by searching for commonalities, shared needs and values, she said, "Wesley is not a place but an idea, an experiment in excellence in which diversity is not just tolerated but embraced." She also used humor, addressing the controversy of her keynote, right? She, acknowledging that she knew they didn't want her there at first. And she said, "Now I know your first choice today was Alice Walker, known for the color purple. And guess how I know," right? At this point of her speech, the audience laughs, right? And she, of course, means of this protest that was organized in front of the university when she was going to speak. Well, and she continued, "Instead, you got me, known for the color of my hair." And at this moment also, the audience laughed. Another way to gain her audience was showing her values and encouraging the audience to share them with her, right? And she said, "But as important as your obligations as a doctor, a lawyer, a business leader will be, you are a human being first. And those human connections with spouses, with children, with friends, are the most important investments you will ever make. At the end of your life, you will never regret not having passed one more test, winning one more verdict, or not closing one more deal. You will regret time not spent with a husband, a child, a friend, or a parent." And finally, surprising her audience in the end with a feminist wink by saying, "Somewhere out in this audience may even be someone who will follow in my steps and preside over the White House as the president's spouse. I wish him well." Right? By using the pronoun him instead of her, he was implying that the president would be a woman. And of course, she received an overwhelming applause at the end. So even though the audience didn't want her in the beginning, in the end, she managed to gain the audience, and her ethos improved. In the same way that, Mrs. Bush encountered a hostile audience, precisely because she wasn't a professional woman, and also because she hadn't finished high school. I will pose the following question. Do you think that someone who has never graduated from college could be invited to keynote a commencement address? Well, here we have another very well-famous example, which is Steve Jobs' commencement address at Stanford in 2005. Well, actually, Steve Jobs, right, hadn't graduated from college either, and he actually addresses this issue at the beginning of his speech, right? He says, "Truth be told, this is the closest I've ever gotten to a college graduation." As opposed to Mrs. Bush, Steve Jobs didn't encounter a hostile audience, as I was saying, but one that trusted him. And the thing is, why did the audience trust Steve Jobs but didn't trust Mrs. Bush? What was the difference between them when both of them, or neither of them, had actually graduated from college? Well, I think what made the difference between them was probably Steve Jobs' life's achievements. Achievements that everybody knows, right? His first his first founding of the company Apple, and the first personal computer that he created in his garage with a friend, the Apple First, in 1976, as you can see in the picture. A year later, he created Apple II, which practically was the first, or one of the first, massively produced and sold personal computers. After that came Macintosh, and then Pixar, when he was expelled from the company that he had founded. Of course, the famous picture Toy Story, and also other gadgets such as iPods, iPads, MacBooks, and so on. Right? So all these life achievements made Steve Jobs a trustworthy speaker. However, I don't think that was the only reason why the audience was moved by his speech. Right? Actually, it was another appeal that actually moved the audience, and that's the third appeal that we're going to have a look at, which is pathos, or emotion. Let's have a look at this first appeal first. Right? Pathos has to do with appealing to emotions and needs. Okay? Listeners need to be motivated, and to motivate your audience, you need to link the topic to their beliefs, values, personal goals, and emotions. And that's precisely what Barbara Bush did, remember, when she was trying to reach the audience. Well, emotional and psychological reasons to support your decisions may be as influential, or even more, as logical ones. Right? So logos and pathos is as important as logos, and of course as ethos. Pathos relies basically on appeals to emotions and needs, as we said. Let's deal with emotions first. Pathos relies on appeals to emotions, but not only positive emotions, which of course is probably the most important group of emotions. Positive core beliefs and values like freedom, individualism, love, peace, pride, approval, hope, generosity, courage, loyalty. But it also relies on negative emotions, feelings such as guilt, shame, hatred, fear, insecurity, anger, and anxiety, which are unpleasant feelings, but they are often useful when we want to motivate the audience, when we want to move the audience and to avoid real dangers. Negative emotions are actually used in campaigns to move the audience to help. Right? For example, this one, millions of children are suffering around the world. The one who designs this campaign wants to move these negative feelings of guilt, of saying fear, insecurity, for the audience to help. Right? And also narratives are good ways to highlight emotions. We're going to have a look at an example now. But before that, we're going to talk about pathos appealing to needs. Right? We said that pathos appeals to emotions and needs. Regarding needs, right? Human beings have many different types of needs. On the bottom line of our needs are the basic needs, which are basically survival needs. And you need to link your topic to these survival needs to be persuasive. Also, needs of security and safety, right? So you can explain your audience how to gain peace of mind, how to gain job security, safety, comfort, a better health, physical safety. The next step in our needs is love and belonging. So show that your topic helps listeners be better friends, creates a stronger community, or build ties between people. Also, the need of STEAM, right? Demonstrate that you respect your listeners and mention their achievements, their accomplishments. Make them feel competent to carry out your proposals. Let them know their ideas are significant. Finally, you can challenge your listeners to look beyond themselves and reach out for others, right? Encourage them to accomplish unique things, right? What we can call self-actualization. let me return to Steve Jobs' commencement address, okay? And we're going to talk about in what way the audience was moved by his speech. Actually, Steve Jobs' commencement address is inspirational for everybody. And actually, he used this strategy that I mentioned before, which is narratives, right? Steve Jobs mentioned 3 narratives, 3 life stories in his speech. The first one he called Connecting the Dots. This first story was about his decision to drop college and how that decision allowed him to learn other things that were later useful in life, right? He says, you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust that the dots will connect in your future. The second story he called Love and Loss. And talks about what you love to do and you can what can happen if you lose it, right? As what happened to him. He actually founded the company Apple, and but he ended up being fired from the company. And he says that even though he was devastated at first, it was actually the best thing that could ever happen to him because it allowed him to begin again. And in fact, he then founded 2 very successful companies, Next and Pixar. And it was also then when he met his wife and found his love. This is what he says in the speech. Sometimes life hits you in the head with a brick. Don't lose faith. You've got to find what you love. The only way to be truly satisfied is to do what you believe is great work. And the only way to do great work is to love what you do. If you haven't found it yet, keep looking, don't settle. The third story, the third narrative, is about death. And here he tells his personal story about how he had overcome a cancer that doctors at first thought that would be incurable. And knowing that one day he would die made him focus on the important things and not worry about taking risks. This is when he said his famous sentence, death is very likely the single best invention of life. And he gave the students who were listening to him this advice. Your time is limited, so don't waste it living somebody else's life. Don't be trapped by dogma, which is living with the results of other people's thinking. Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown your own inner voice. And most important, have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. And he ended up with the advice, stay hungry, stay foolish. So as you can see, actually, Steve Jobs, of course, he had a trustworthy ethos before he started. But it was emotions that moved the audience, actually. He used several positive emotions, several positive core beliefs and values, such as individualism, love, peace, freedom, hope, courage. But he also appealed to negative emotions and values such as insecurity, fear, death, loss, guilt, and shame. And this is probably what made his speech so memorable. Okay, so pathos can be one of the ways to move your audience, right? But beware of abusing pathos, right? As a speaker, you should ask yourself, am I playing on irrational fears? And as a listener, you have to ask yourself, why am I feeling guilty? Is my guilt reasonable? Is the speaker trying to manipulate me through my feelings? So be careful with excessive emotional appeals because they can cloud your logical reasoning. Make sure emotion is used ethically, of course, and be aware that a speaker may use your emotions for his or her own profit rather than yours. And this is actually an introduction to what is our next topic, which is fallacies. Okay, this is the last lesson in our module. In fallacies, let me recall what we said in the introduction. A fallacy is an argument that is more persuasive than it should be because it rests on faulty premises and assumptions. There are different types of fallacies corresponding to the three different appeals. So we have, we can use each appeal fallaciously. That is, we have ethical fallacies. Like, for example, if you vote for X, you will regret, right? By appealing to threats, you are trying to persuade your audience. Also, logical fallacies, which, of course, these threaten to your reason. Like, all Spaniards are bullfighters, right? Which could be considered a hasty generalization because, of course, not everybody, not all Spaniards are bullfighters. And pathetic fallacies, which are, for example, appeals to pity, such as when a student tells the teacher, if I don't pass this exam, I won't be able to graduate, right? To appeal to the teacher's pity for, to get a pass mark. So, in general, we can say, well, we should avoid fallacies, right? Because fallacies are a failure in reasoning that leads to unsound or misleading arguments. So, a word of caution on this. Now we're going to have a look at different types of fallacies corresponding to the three different appeals. So you're going to see that logical fallacies are the largest ones, right? But we also have ethical fallacies and pathetic fallacies. This typology is based on the University of Maryland Writing Center. The examples are somehow adapted from their examples. Well, the first type of fallacy is what is called in Latin petitio principii, in English is begging the question, which is basically a circular argument. In this case, you are using the premise and the conclusion are the same, right? Like abortion is murder since killing a baby is an act of murder. In this case, both the premise, abortion is murder, and the conclusion are the same, right? So it's what is called a circular argument. The next one is loaded question, in which presuppositions are assumed in the question. For example, if you say, have you stopped beating your wife? Well, this kind of question presupposes that he has beaten his wife, or she has beaten her wife. Either you say yes or no, the same presupposition holds, right? So that's why there's a kind of presupposition in the question itself. The next one is called hasty generalization. It's a conclusion based on inadequate or insufficient evidence, the one we saw before about all Spaniards are bullfighters. The next one is called in Latin post hoc ergo propter hoc, which in English is faulty cause. In this one, we mistake correlation for causation. That is, the fact that one thing happens after the other is taken for the one being the cause or the effect of the other. Right? Like, for example, sex education courses have resulted in increased promiscuity among teens. The next one is oversimplification, which are the possible causes are reduced dramatically. For example, eating fast food is the cause of heart diseases. Of course, eating fast food can be one of the causes of heart diseases, but it's not the only one. Here we have a couple of fallacies which are actually contradictory, one to the other. It's like two sides of the same coin. One is composition, the other one is division. And it's the quality is when you assume that the quality of the parts is going to be also in the whole or the other way around. That is, that's division. Right? An example of composition would be, since most students in my class get A's, they must get good grades in the rest of the courses. Well, not necessarily. Right? Division is just the opposite. I got an A on a group paper, so I should do well on the individual exam. Right? So we can see that they are, I mean, those they are not based on reason. Okay, the next one is called appeal to ignorance, and this one has to do with a proposition that must be true because there is no evidence to refute it. Right? For example, extraterrestrials don't exist because we don't have evidence that they do. Well, the fact that we don't have a clear evidence doesn't mean that they don't exist. Well, maybe they do exist, but we don't have the evidence. The next one is called straw person, also known as straw man. Straw person is the ungendered term for the fallacy, which is stating the opponent's argument in an exaggerated form. right? For example, higher taxes for the wealthy implies defending class welfare. Therefore, don't vote for him, right? Okay. Then the red herring, which is using irrelevant assertions to divert the audience from another issue. For instance, you think my department is squandering the company's funds. The other departments are much worse. Right? So it's like focusing the attention on somebody else. The next one is called equivocation, which is obscuring the truth with ambiguity. In this case, you use words with more than one possible meaning. Well, this one is pretty obvious. There are others that are not that obvious, right? If dogs and trees both bark, why are the trees so silent? False dilemma, which is the reduction to a simple either-or situation. It is also called a false dichotomy. It's like presenting that there are only two options when there may be more. For example, you are either with us or against us. The next one is shifting the burden of proof, which is basically putting the responsibility on the listener. Right? It's like saying, well, prove me wrong. Right? If you can't prove me wrong, then I'm right. An example would be unicorns exist. Can you prove they don't? Well, there you are. Right? They exist. The next list of fallacies are ethical fallacies, those that are addressed to ethos. The first one is an irrelevant appeal to authority. In this case, of course, we are appealing to the wrong authority to defend a premise. For example, my classmates said we didn't have to study for the exam. Well, I mean, only the teacher can probably say that, right? Not another student. Ad hominem attacks, this one is when you attack the listener instead of attacking his or her premises. For example, are you going to trust her when she didn't graduate from the best school? Guilty by association. In this case, you attack the company people keep instead of attacking their propositions, their beliefs. For example, do you really want to vote for a man who has been endorsed by communists? Poisoning the well, in this case, is predisposing the audience not to trust the speaker. Like for example, let's listen to what Mr. Smith has to say about civic duty when he's a convicted felon. The next one is fallacy of origins, that is, something is good or bad because of its origins. Right? Like for example, I only buy oil processed in Spain because the best oils are processed here. The next one in Latin is called tu quoque, but in English is you too, right? Which is you can't fire me for being late when you're late all the time. Right? That is, if you do it wrong, well, you shouldn't judge me. The next one is appeal to poverty, is by implying that just because it is poor, it is good. Like for example, if you can get rid of all your stuff, you'll live a happier life. Or you can appeal to tradition or newness. These are also two opposite values, but only because only because it's a tradition or because it's something modern or new, they are not necessarily good, right? These examples show. The first one is an appeal to tradition. If our founding fathers did it this way, why change it, right? Or the opposite. This is the latest Mac, so it should be the best, right? Appeal to wealth is actually the opposite of appeal to poverty that we saw before, or also appeal to nature, right? These are two examples. Successful people are correct, otherwise they would have failed, right? Or appeal to nature, processed food are killing us, let's eat only raw food, right? Well, so these are all examples of ethical fallacies. The last type of fallacies are pathetic fallacies, which are abusing pathos. The first one is called the bandwagon appeal, which implies that if somebody does it, well, everybody should do it. Like for example, most students choose to study science over human arts, so science is better. Threats, appealing to fear of the audience, right? If you vote my opponent, we'll all suffer the consequences. Also appeal to pity that we saw before. Well, when the student told the teacher, if I don't pass this exam, I won't be able to graduate. Also, can be an appeal to pride, like surely someone so smart as you will agree with me. Okay? Or an anecdote, what is called anecdotal fallacy, which is because I have one experience, that doesn't mean that everything should be that way, right? For example, how can that restaurant be the best in the city if the waiter who served me was so rude? Or the fallacy that is called if by whiskey, right? In this case, the name of this fallacy comes from who did it for the first time, basically. And actually, this has to do with supporting both sides of an issue, right? This comes from a famous speech by Noah Sweet Jr., who took both sides of the issue about legalizing alcohol in Mississippi, right? He didn't actually take one position. So he says, you ask me how I feel about whiskey. When you say whiskey, you mean X, then I am certainly against it. But if you mean Y, then I am certainly for it. That's my stand. I will not regret from it. I will not compromise. That is, he doesn't say anything, right? So he says both things. And this is it. This is the end of Module 9, who was devoted to persuasion. Thank you very much for listening.